Welcome to the Mount of Olives. This mountain is named, of course, after the abundant groves of olives that you find here. In fact, you don't see a whole lot of olive trees? Yeah, I kind of noticed that, me too. But I guess there was a time when they grew all over the place here, and people remembered. They remembered because this place has a long history. And that's what's important about it. Its long and illustrious history. This mountain, it turns out, is mostly made up of chalk and flint, which means that the ground is very unstable. It is not very suitable for building things on. And that is why, though it is right beside a large and metropolitan city, it has remained almost completely naked of buildings. But the ground is good, however, for digging and tunneling. And that is why, ever since ancient times, people have been buried here. Some of the great kings who ruled in the city of Jerusalem are buried on this mountain, as well as many important and prosperous Jews from down through the ages. But the composition of the ground is not the only reason why people choose to be buried here. One of the oldest graves on this mountain belongs to a man named Zechariah. And in his day, Zechariah made a prophecy. He promised to the people of Israel that when their Messiah came, he would stand on this mountain. He would stand on the very peak of the Mount of Olives, and when he did, the mountain itself would be split in two, to the north and the south. And the people would be saved by passing through the valley that was created. Now, many people have understood this to mean that at the end of the age, when the Messiah comes, the resurrection of the dead will begin right here. And that is why people want to be buried here. They figure if they're here and the resurrection of the dead begins, they get to be at the very front of the line. And so this graveyard on the Mount of Olives has become the most popular gravesite in the entire world. And Jews from all over the world and down through history desire keenly to be buried here. In fact, you might almost say that people are dying to get here. I wouldn't say that, but you might say that. But just being dead isn't enough, of course. It's also one of the most exclusive graveyards in the world, and only the most prosperous, only the most prestigious have a chance of being buried here. And so you see, even up to this very day, the Mount of Olives is a place that is strongly associated with the Messiah. And if that is true today, it was certainly true almost 2,000 years ago when a man named Jesus from a town called Nazareth in Galilee stood on the top of that mountain, on the very spot where Zechariah had promised that the Messiah would appear. And already at this point, there had been some who had seen in Jesus this promised Messiah. So surely already there were rumors and talk spreading through the crowd about this man and who he was. And as he stood there on the Mount of Olives, all eyes must have been fixed upon him. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of eyes, because you see, from the top of that mountain, Jesus would have been visible from the city, from the Temple Mount. And everyone was looking at him. And as they looked at him, they were wondering what was he going to do now. For whatever he did, it would surely be a sign of who he was and who he claimed to be. And of course, as we all know, what Jesus did was turn to his disciples and say, "Guys, quick, go get me something to ride." It's an odd request when you think about it. I mean, after all, Jesus has come all this way. done it all on foot. And here he is at the very last leg of his journey, maybe a kilometer left, but it's downhill all the way, and now he decides he needs something to ride. But you see, Jesus' request for something to ride is not about his practical needs at this point. There's nothing practical about it. No, it's all about the symbolism. It's about how people will see it. You see, at this point, if Jesus had turned and asked for his disciples to go get him a horse or a chariot, that would have marked him as a king or a general who had come to conquer the city. But Jesus did not send his disciples to find a horse. If he wanted to proclaim to the world how important he was, how prosperous and prestigious, he could have sent them to get a litter, carried by 4, maybe even 6 slaves. But Jesus did not send them to hire a litter. If he wanted to come and make a promise of economic prosperity, I suppose he could have ridden in an ox cart full of wares to be traded. But no, he did not send his disciples to get an ox cart. What he did send them to find, of course, as we all know, was a donkey. Why a donkey? What did that mean? Well, part of it, of course, was about another prophecy, also from that same prophet, the prophet Zechariah, who had promised the city of Jerusalem that when her king came to it, he would come riding on a donkey, on the colt, the foal of a donkey. And so by choosing at this very moment, while everyone was watching him, to ride a donkey, Jesus was making a public proclamation that he was coming to fulfill that prophecy. In fact, he was claiming, indeed for the first time publicly, to be the long sought-for Messiah. But what kind of Messiah was he claiming to be? Because it seems pretty clear he wasn't claiming to be the kind of Messiah who would come in violence to conquer. Nor was he the kind of Messiah who would come to bring prosperity to those already wealthy. So what kind of Messiah had he come to be? Well, Matthew, the writer of this gospel, spares no time in telling us exactly what kind of Messiah Jesus had come to be. For he tells us that immediately on making that trip down to the Mount of Olives, no sooner does he get to the bottom of the hill than he enters into the city and he goes right to the temple. And when he gets there, as is recorded in all of the Gospels, he begins to create quite a ruckus. He overturns the tables of the money changers. He stops people who are buying and selling. He overturns the seats of those who are selling sacrificial doves. Causes huge problems. But it's kind of interesting because, you see, at least as Matthew tells the tale, that's not what really gets people upset with Jesus. Read it carefully. When Jesus does this in Matthew's gospel, the other gospels, yes, he gets into all kinds of trouble. But Matthew simply reports it. And then he goes on to say something else, something that the other gospel writers, for whatever reason, just failed to mention. Matthew also tells us that Jesus was there in the temple courtyards and that he was healing the blind and the lame. And also, that he had brought these children with him, and the children were running all over the place and making lots of noise and shouting and crying out. And at least the way that Matthew tells the story, it was this part of what Jesus did that really got people upset with him. Not so much the other side. And there's a good reason why people were very upset with Jesus for this. For there were laws. And there were customs in the temple in Jerusalem, as we talked about last week when we were talking about the shelters that were in Bethany. And these laws stated that the poor and the blind and the lame, and especially those who were marred in any way, were not allowed to be seen anywhere around the Temple Mount. For it was believed that the very presence of these people, if they were seen, would sully the sanctity of the temple. But here it appears that Jesus has brought these very people with him right into the temple. Probably brought them with him all the way from Bethany. And so when you first look at it, it may seem that Jesus choosing to heal people in the temple is a mere extension of his ministry of healing up in Galilee. But it's not. See, for Jesus to heal a blind man in Bethsaida, or to heal a lame woman in Capernaum of Galilee, is one thing. But to do it in the temple, this sacred site, the center of the universe as far as ancient Judaism is concerned, is something quite different. To do it in Galilee causes a bit of a stir. People look at it, they are amazed, they are awed, they look at Jesus as this strange man who cares about these people, but that's it. But to do it in the temple means something very different. And in fact, what Jesus is doing here is he's rubbing the people's noses in their failure to take care of these, the most vulnerable people in their society. And of course, they were required, according to the laws of the Old Testament, to look specifically out for these people. And they have failed to do it. Jesus is showing them in no uncertain terms. And since a lot of the healing that Jesus did throughout his career had to do with dealing with the problems caused by poverty, it was the malnutrition that was causing the blindness, it was the depression, it was the rampant illness and infections that were spreading because of the economic collapse that created all of this sickness that Jesus was healing. His healing of these people in the temple is also an indictment of that society and its failure to construct a society where there was opportunity for all people, as was required in the Old Testament. So yeah, Jesus created a certain disturbance in the temple, overturned the temple tables, and messed things up. That was an inconvenience. People didn't like it, of course. But what really got to them was when Jesus brought all the wrong kinds of people into the temple. And of course, then there's also the matter of the children. The children are there in the temple and they're yelling and they're screaming and making an ungodly ruckus. That's a little bit different, of course, than the question of the poor and the lame, because the children were allowed. They were welcome in the temple courtyards, at least at times. There were certain religious observances that required the children to come, but when they came, they were to be seen but not heard. And it was generally agreed that the children had nothing to say of any value. But what does Jesus say? As they are crying out, screaming praise to him and to the Messiah he's come to be, he tells the authorities that these children have taken over their jobs, that out of the mouths of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise for yourself. That's what God says. These children have taken over because the leadership has failed to do what is right. And so what was happening there? As Jesus brought in the sick and the lame and the blind, and he healed them, as he brought in the children and allowed them to speak and praised them for speaking, what Jesus was doing was he was undercutting the authority of the people who were in charge in that temple in Jerusalem. And they weren't going to stand for it. They'll put up with disruptions. They'll put up with the overturning of the table. But you challenge their authority, and you know what? They're going to get you. And indeed, before the week is out, they got it. On Palm Sunday, Jesus stood on the top of the Mount of Olives. In that very place where Zechariah promised the Messiah would appear. And by getting on the back of the donkey and climbing down that mountain, riding down that mountain, he claimed to be that Messiah. But what kind of Messiah? A Messiah for the prosperous, the wealthy, the important, those who are able to buy a plot of land on that mountain? No. He came to be Messiah for the poor, the forgotten, the outsiders. The kind of Messiah, honestly, that this world still needs. Will you take a few moments in silent reflection? Lord Jesus, we often make assumptions about what kind of Messiah you are, what kind of Messiah you can be. Help us to question those assumptions so that we can begin to see you as the Messiah you really came to be.